who have turned up. I think this is the worst ratio of seat occupancy to seats provided in my entire time as a university faculty member. It even beats the time I spoke at a sociology conference on the very last session on a Sunday, where the absolute number of people attending was lower, but the ratio was not quite as bad. My all-time lowest audience actually was 1, when as a PhD student I was speaking at the PhD competition for thesis of the year. And there were 4 of us shortlisted and 4 judges. And the 4 judges didn't want us to be able to see their faces, so they sat behind us. And we were timetabled at this conference, bizarrely, against free trips to all sorts of places. It was in Madrid, and there were free trips to the galleries, etc. So we had an audience of 1 person who didn't speak English. And 3 of us spoke in English, and the 4th one spoke in Spanish, and it was her best friend. So she was the only audience member. And that is the only time I have ever spoken without getting a single question at the end. So hopefully we'll do a little better than that. I should say, having seen the programme, at some level I'm not surprised there aren't many people here. There are some, at the risk of reducing my audience further, there are some other sessions which I would have liked to have been at. But you kind of can't do that if you're one of the speakers. In particular, the one on the pupil premium and FSM, and of course the EPSI study session, I think will be absolutely fascinating. And at one level, part of me wonders why you're not at those. Now, this session is about the Department for Education, but it's about you as much as it's about me. Now, I will say something about me for those of you who don't know me. This time last year, Carol Willis was Chief Analyst at the DfE. Some of you will know Carol. She's still in the sector, obviously. And she was replaced by 2 of us, part-time. Donna Ward, who is Chief Analyst with me, who is part-time, and I'm also part-time. And for the rest of my part-time life, I teach at the London School of Economics, where I teach economic history. And I've written papers on a wide variety of subjects. Gender wage inequality in Sweden was my most recent paper. I have written about education, but only in Tudor times. And so let's just say the Permanent Secretary is not too worried about any potential conflict between me as an academic writing about Tudor England and me as Chief Analyst. You can't really read much into what I say about vocational education in the Tudor period to my views that I'm, of course, no longer allowed to express as a civil servant. So as an academic, I get the pressures that you as academics are under. I understand the pressures of wretched things like the REF. I guess as a civil servant, I'm not supposed to say that, so please don't tweet it. Government initiatives such as the REF, the publish or perish thing, etc. But I also understand that there are many academics who wish not only to be outstanding academics, but also wish to influence the country we live in. And my job today is to tell you something about how we in DfE want to be receptive to those of you who wish to engage with that agenda. Now, there is a sort of strand of criticism of the department that says almost the department shouldn't exist. We should just give out the money and leave it to professionals. Maybe we should, maybe we shouldn't. But ultimately, we live in a democracy in which taxpayers elect politicians who believe that when we're spending more than £50 billion of taxpayers' money, it's legitimate to have a degree of political oversight. And that's not just true in education. It's true very much in sectors which I think we may not realise it's true for, sectors such as health. When a government minister makes a decision about the relative funding of, say, cancer treatment versus mental health, they will literally be changing the outcomes for people in those areas. Things like the waiting list target for A&E alter the clinical priorities of doctors. So I don't think it's by any means unique that ministers have a role in what actually happens in the ground in education. Indeed, if you look at transport, transport is way more politicised than education. You think about the really big transport issues we're thinking about at the moment, whether to build high-speed 2, whether to build additional aviation capacity, etc., the introduction of the congestion charge, all of these are decisions that are essentially taken at political level. So, my job is to make sure, given that we have politicians who wish to be influential and wish to be in control, and as I say, I think they absolutely have a democratic mandate to do so, is to make sure that they are aware of the evidence. And that's where you come in, because you ultimately create some of the evidence base that we need to hear back in sanctuary buildings. Now, we're serious about research. I spend quite a lot of my time reading research papers. This morning I was reading research papers by Alison Reed, who I'm willing to bet that none of you have heard of. That's not an insult to either you or her, but given that she's based in Australia as an expert on asbestos, I think that's probably far removed from any of your research. Maybe if I had all of the members of BERA, that might not be true. But asbestos, we have asbestos in Britain's schools. And Alison appears to be the world's leading expert on the relative danger of asbestos to children relative to adults. And to my surprise, it appears that children are better able to resist asbestos fibres than are adults, a finding that's also been replicated in laboratory experiments on rats of different ages. So as I say, I read research papers. And research papers can have really big effects. Research papers by academics and research papers by the wider intellectual and research community. So perhaps the biggest one that's had an effect this term is the creation of universal infant free school meals. Now that's a big policy. From memory, that's a £400 million a year policy. I mean, how influential do you want to be? And a big part of that came from the IFS research on the pilots. And here is the IFS press release, which I dug out from 2 years ago. It's headlined in the way that only the Institute for Fiscal Studies can. Never let it be said they're appealing to a tabloid audience. Offering free school meals to all primary school pupils increased attainment in disadvantaged areas. It's not the snappiest headline, but it's a really good headline because it tells you the answer. And one thing that really disappoints me as a civil servant is the titles that so many people have chosen at this conference. They don't tell me the answer. They say, an investigation. As a policy person, I need to know what the answer is, because there's a heck of a lot of papers in there. And even with the best will in the world, we are not, in DfE head office, going to read all of them unless we know what they say. Not because we care whether you say the answer is yes or no. I'm not saying we're only going to read the ones that agree with us, but we need to know roughly what it is that you're saying. We're interested in your evidence base, your methodology, etc. So that's a good headline from my point of view. And if it said it did not increase attainment, I would be just as interested, because it's telling me something that's relevant to me. I care about attainment in disadvantaged areas, therefore I care about a paper that tells me whether a potential policy affects it. And then the abstract, when all primary school pupils in Newham and Durham were offered free school meals, that's a good start from my point of view. It tells me this is evidence about Britain. Ultimately, you can be doing great academic work on countries that are not obviously similar to England, and I'm inherently going to be less interested in that paper. Not to say you shouldn't write it, of course, but. And it then goes on to tell me the size of the effect. They made between 4 and 8 weeks more progress over a 2-year period. Now, we can argue whether 4 or 8 weeks is a big or small number, but that's very helpful to ministers in understanding what that means. Telling me there's a Z-score is fine. The analysts in DfE Towers can cope with Z-scores, but it's absolutely no good my going to ministers and saying, but there's a Z-score. The T-statistic is 2.6. Telling people that this is 4 to 8 weeks better progress is very helpful. And if you want to be influential, you need to be thinking about how you write up, not your academic articles, they need to be written up in the usual way, but how you write up a note that you send in, how you write up a press release like this. And it then goes on to say, this is the main finding of new research published today by a consortium comprising the IFS, NatSen Social Research and Bryson Purdon Social Research. And again, that's good. The IFS are great at numbers, but they're not obvious people for social research. So it's telling me that this is a paper that does more than just crunching numbers. And that's appealing. We like mixed methods in DfE. Other things that academics have been influential. Some of you will know we have a new approach to Key Stage 4 accountability that's now based on progress rather than just attainment. I think that's a great step forward. It's been widely welcomed in the profession. I had an audience of 250 earlier this week when I was speaking to heads at an SSAT conference. Now, to do that, we need to know the transition matrix from Key Stage 2 to Key Stage 4. And we wanted to demonstrate that it was fair. We wanted something that was best practice. So we went out and hired top quality academics to do it. Because the people we hired know every single econometric technique under the sun. They can check for all sorts of biases, and their conclusions will be seen to be fair because they're entirely independent. And Simon Burgess wrote his paper along with Dave Thompson, and that was the basis for what we did. And we wanted that independent academic seal of approval so that everyone knew that there wasn't some ministerial preference or civil servant's natural desire to please those who call the tune. Another piece of research that's been very influential, and in fact influential and has received recognition this week here at this conference, is the EBSI study. I was absolutely delighted to see that BERA had awarded Kathy Silver their inaugural fellowship yesterday. I think she's formally presented with it tomorrow, isn't she? But it's been announced, so we know. And that is truly great work, and it's been very influential. Again, we've now got the 2-year-old offer, now originally 20%, now moving to 40% of children. And that's based on an increasing academic evidence base that says early years really matters. Not for childcare and maternal employment, we can cover that through tax credits, but for children's education. So again, a piece of research that's been hugely, hugely influential. And her colleagues' emphasis on the importance of qualifications of people has again been something that ministers have been very interested in. So, these are big policies. These are not trivial little policies. Secondary accountability, free school meals, early years education, these are big things. So never think for a moment that you cannot be influential, because you can be, and some people are. And these are not just random things. It's not that the minister bumped into one of these people in the lift, though I must say civil servants are always worried about who the minister may bump into in the lift or on holiday or walking down the street. But they're part of a pattern at DfE that we wish to be more analytical. And we wish to be more analytical at every level. We wish to be more analytical inside the department. We wish to be more analytical in terms of talking to people outside. And we also want schools to be more analytical and evidence-based. So internally, there are all sorts of things we do that you would recognize as analytical. Just working out how many pupils there are going to be in schools is not trivial. Not least because we have to have the schools where the people are. You know, how many people move? Are the previous patterns at which people move out of central London as they have children holding? What are our reserve positions if our predictions are not right? How many teachers do we have to train each year? I was hearing in the previous session an academic, Paul Connolly, talking about the problems of Northern Ireland, where apparently they train approximately 5 times as many teachers as they need each year. Only 18% of trained teachers get a job in their first year. And as he said, this is woefully inefficient and really, really unhelpful. It makes teaching a really big gamble to go into, and he argued that this is, it's not, you aren't even getting the right people coming through. We have to model. And we're doing huge amounts of modelling there by individual subject at secondary level as well as at primary phase. We need to look at things like the gender composition of the workforce. A lot more 28 to 35-year-old women drop out of the labour force for a few years than the equivalent number of men. We have to take that into account. We have to look at the age profile of teachers by different disciplines. This is analytical work that we're interested in. If any of you are doing work on that sort of thing, believe me, I'd be delighted to hear from you, preferably by tomorrow morning. I had hoped. You never know. We also commission research. So if we think about some of the big policies that we're doing at the moment, high-profile ones, universal infant free school meals, there will come a point where we will commission work, either from academics or big research organisations, into the effect of a policy like that. You don't spend 400 million a year recurrent without working out what the effects are. Effects in a pilot are great. They're a great basis for forming policy, but we really need to know whether those pilots' results hold elsewhere. The other one obvious at the moment that's been in the news is the Shanghai Maths Programme. We're sending a bunch of teachers to Shanghai to see how Shanghai does things differently and getting a bunch of maths teachers over to Shanghai to work with British schools. Is it going to be effective? Is it not? Well, ultimately there's only one way to try it, and that's to try it. But having tried it, you have to evaluate it. And again, that's the sort of thing that we will almost certainly contract out. The other thing that we pay for, ministers are often accused of being very short-term and governments being very short-term, but actually we do some things that are very long-term. And the classic one here is longitudinal studies. Longitudinal studies are very expensive, and they tell you nothing very quickly. But government after government, ministers after ministers have commissioned these. So previous governments commissioned the EPSI survey, or originally the EPI survey, that then got extended. We've had the longitudinal survey of young people of England, which I can never pronounce as an acronym because I get the letters in the wrong order. And we're now having the second one of those that will then allow us to compare children of a certain age with how they were a few years ago. And indeed, we'll be publishing the first outcomes of that very soon. Notes are being sent up to ministers, literally, at the moment, telling them what findings we get from those. And all ministers of all parties have been keen to lay down that sort of evidence base. And again, we will be making the data available to people. Now, the other thing that we did was we published the Research Priority and Question papers. Now, that's a wonderfully snappy title that could only come from government, that set out a whole bunch of questions that we are interested in a whole range of issues. Adoption, academies, you name it. Questions that we at capital spending, I mean, we spend a lot of money on capital. How can we give good incentives to schools to look after their building when government has a tendency to rebuild the schools that are most falling down? Are we in danger of creating perverse incentives, and what can be done about it? And that listed a whole bunch of questions, and our hope is that people who are inherently doing research in these areas, these are not a list of things we're about to commission research on. There was a lot of questions there. But they're areas where we want academics to say, I saw that you're interested in this question. Here's a paper I wrote. And one guy did this, Daniel Mugis, I actually don't know how you pronounce his name, he's Flemish, at the University of Southampton, saw that we'd asked a question about what made some academy chains more successful than others. And he'd done a conference presentation on this, looking at British Academy chains and showing that the more centralised ones had higher value added. And his argument was you needed a strong head office to be effective. That was his research finding. You know, other people want to think about that more. But he just sent it to me with a nice short summary on the front, and that went up to ministers. It went up to Lord Nash and Michael Gove, because it struck me as a paper that they would be genuinely interested in. And so I sent it up. And we're keen for people to do that. As I say, it's really helpful if there's a nice ministerial friendly summary on the front. So, those of you who are doing, no matter what your area of research is, there's almost certainly a question that you can speak to. You don't have to speak to it, but you can speak to it, and we would be delighted if you did. The other thing that we've created to increase our interactions with you is the academic pool, the associate academic pool, which is a bunch of researchers who've told us they're happy to do research for us. We put this out as a general call, and a lot of people replied, and they were generally very good. I think it's fair to say that poor old Susanna, sitting in the middle here, had to do a lot more work than she had expected. I hasten to add, she's delighted. So, no, she's content. That's always the civil service phrase. She's content at the number of applicants who came forward. We now have 174 people on the books. Now, that's a lot. And in all probability, we're not going to hire all 174 in any given year. But there were people with real expertise. Some of them gave very narrow things. And they said, I'm only interested in doing research on this. Now, that's great. If we want some research on that and you're the world leader on that, we will come to you for sure. We may not come to you, who knows. But it's a way of us saying, in a nice, easy fashion, without going through all the rigmarole of sort of all this tendering, etc., that if you're the right person to do this sort of job, we will hire you to do it. And I, in the past, have been hired, particularly by BIS, for doing work on that basis. I've worked for the Foresight, when I was a sort of full-time academic, I did work particularly for Go Science in the Foresight unit for them on that basis. They would ring you up and say either we just want to hire you or we've got 2 or 3 people, we know one of you can do this job well, who wants to do it? And we're keen to do that so it becomes more informal give and take. We also want to champion the role of evidence in schools. Now DfE is not in control of schools. I mean, let's be clear about that. We have a school-led system. Head teachers are overwhelmingly the most important people in making those decisions, supported by their senior leadership teams, supported by their governors, and supported by the wider school community. But we are very keen to see the better provision of evidence. And that's why I was very excited yesterday. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you yesterday, but I was at a different education conference yesterday. I was at the Durham Chem 30-year celebration. And it was a very different room to this. It was one of those flat rooms of everybody sitting around circular tables, so it's like an awards dinner without any awards, and half the people don't get a very good view. But it was a really good mix of academics and teachers, head teachers, mainstream teachers, the whole lot. And it was a really good interchange about what do we know, particularly what do we know that we didn't know a few years ago. And that's why we created the EEF. We gave them a huge, great endowment. They're not even dependent on the annual cycle of funding because we wanted to say that evidence is a long-term thing. So we gave them the funding, they live off essentially the interest, and we hope that that creates something permanent that will go on to be there for year after year after year. We're also keen for the EEF to do work on dissemination. It's not just about creating evidence, it's getting it into schools. And that's why we're very keen on things like the toolkit that sets out what works most effectively and what is much less effective, both in terms of the size of the effect, but also the value for money, so that school teachers and school leaders can say, actually, you know what? Elsewhere, that seems to work. Why don't I try it? And that's what we want. We don't want to have a top-down sort of system whereby, the Secretary of State says, you shall teach this on Monday morning at this time. That's not generally the way we operate. Not quite, but not generally. We want teachers to be empowered to use that evidence. Research Ed is another great organisation. I don't know how many of you have been to a Research Ed conference that tries again to narrow this gap between those who create evidence and those who use it. So, what can you do? Well, the first thing you've got to do if you want to be influential is to say something interesting. I've had PhD students, and sometimes you do a piece of work that you think is going to be interesting, and ultimately the results just aren't. The results are fuzzy, they're mixed, and I was talking to one former PhD student who's now employed in the department, and she said, you can't really say that my PhD was a man bites dog story. She said, I'm not even sure the dog bit the man in my PhD. She said, it was more the dog lay in the sun where probably we always thought it was laying anyway. And there's a limit, you have to have something to say if you want to be influential. And then you have to get it to us. It's no good thinking, I've published in a famous journal, I'm sure that the Secretary of State will read your paper, because they're not going to. You see the amount of paper that goes to secretaries of states and other ministers. Literally, you know, we're talking about stacks of paper this big day in, day out. And that's where saying it in an accessible manner is very useful. Now, there are lots of ways of doing that. You know, go talk to Warwick sitting there. You know, he's a guy who really knows how to get stuff out there. You know, can you write things for the TES? Can you write things that are more popular? Can you speak at events where you're reaching out beyond the academic community to the policy community? If you can, I really urge you to do that as often as possible. Are there think tanks that might be interested in writing up your research? Most think tanks are delighted to get unsolicited offers from people to write short notes for them, particularly if you don't want paying. All think tanks just about run on a shoestring. What are the different ways that you can get your message across? You know, it's amazing. I remember when I was an academic, I had an idea with a colleague, and we could not get it taken seriously until it appeared as a letter in the Financial Times. And at that point, I understand, it then appears in the minister's press cuttings, and the minister said, oh, I'd be interested in finding more about that. There are lots of different ways of breaking through. And two people you really want to get to know are these two people, of which Catherine on the far side is much the easiest to get to know, just because she has distinctive coloured hair. Now, the one thing about Catherine is her hair is not a consistent colour from year to year, or even month to month, but it is consistently different to almost everybody else's. So if next year you come and you see this woman with bright orange hair, there's a very good chance that she is Catherine, and she is the person you should go and see. Susanna, who is more orthodox in her approach to hair colour, I don't really have any approach to hair colour, I'm just glad I still got a little bit of it left, is also worth getting to know, although she's less easy to spot across a crowded room. But these are the people who are leading our efforts to engage with you. So we really want, they're the people I was going to say you want to buy a coffee in the bar, but that sounds like I'm trying to get you to bribe them, which I'm not. So they're the people you want to talk to over coffee, in the bar, etc. Now, the final thing I want to say is don't underestimate the role even of presenting at conferences like this. Because yesterday, Catherine went to a session on initial teacher training in Australia. And she has already written that up as a note, because that was for her the standout, at the risk of embarrassing any of the rest of you who spotted her in your audience, that for her was the standout paper she heard yesterday. So she wrote me up a note on this yesterday evening. You know, we're keen on getting stuff when we see it. And she sent me that note yesterday evening. I think this is really interesting and we could learn from that. Just as I learnt about Northern Ireland today, it had never occurred to me that Northern Ireland would train 5 times as many teachers as it needs. And that seems to me something that I definitely want to follow up. I've taken Paul's email address and I will be following that up. Now, there were so many parallel sessions. The chance of getting Catherine or Susanna in the room, I don't have enough civil servants to send one to every single session at every BERA conference. But even presenting at a conference like this can be the way you break through. But as I say, I encourage you, if you want to be influential, to do the pushing yourself rather than expecting us to spot what you've done. And I'm happy to take questions. I'm happy to take, as are Susanna and Catherine, I'm happy to take questions on absolutely anything you like. And the floor is yours, because this has to be a dialogue. That's the point of this session. So if you didn't come here willing to answer questions, willing to ask questions, well, that's regrettable. Gentleman at the back, if you can say who you are, that would be really good. There's this really big light shining on me, so I can't really see you all very well. I think it's the projector light, but...
Yeah, my name's Graham. I'm a part-time PhD student here. I work in community education, but in the example I'm going to give, it's as a school governor, I speak.
Oh, yes.
I've recently been treated to my training in preparation for performance-related pay for teachers.
Yep.
As an example.
Yep.
At the culmination of this training, I asked the trainer what she thought about this as a policy, and she said she thought it was rubbish. So I thought that was pretty problematic, given the fact that I'd sat there listening to her for 3 hours, and somebody must have paid for that.
Yep.
And I certainly paid for it in terms of my time.
Yep.
Anyway, I thought, you know what I'll do? I'll write to the Department of Education for the evidence basis for performance-related pay for teachers.
Yep.
And I did get a response, which I was pleased to get.
Everybody gets a response,
but
when
I followed the references that were made, I couldn't find any evidence.
You couldn't find any?
I couldn't find any evidence. So the references that were given were not related to any kind of evidence. In fact, the only evidence that I could find that was substantive related to people who worked in manual industries when they put things in boxes, and if they were paid by unit, they actually worked a bit harder. So I went away thinking, well, this is quite interesting, isn't it? Because here's a policy that's going to affect really quite radically schooling and education in my life as a school governor, because I'm now informed that I have a legal obligation to implement all of this. And it might just seem to be based on no evidence at all. So then I find a guy from Edinburgh University who writes about evidence-free policy. And finally, I listened to you telling me that all policy is written on the basis of evidence. So can you help me with my confusion?
Yep. So there's a number of issues there that we need to unpack. The first is about the quality of training you received, and that's absolutely an issue for your school. I don't know if is it a maintained school or is it an academy? It's a maintained school. Then that's almost certainly an issue for your local authority, because your local authority has hired someone to train you and other governors. And if you think they delivered bad training, then that's very much something you should take up with your local authority and say, this person wasn't any good. If they were good despite their views, then obviously that's different. But ultimately, everybody has the right to review. That trainer has one vote, just as you have one vote and I have one vote. And for that matter, the Secretary of State has one vote in the general election. And that's right and proper. Now, there is a big evidence base on. Firstly, we've got to be clear about what we mean by performance-related pay, because there's lots of different versions of this. So the most extreme of this is, as you say, it's very often in manual labour, where you are literally paying by the piece. So what's called the piece rate system. And indeed, the work that I referred to earlier that I've done on gender wage inequality in Sweden looked in particular at, sorry, I'm allowed a diversion here, always a danger of asking academics something they themselves have written on. One thing we found, my Swedish co-authors and I, is that actually paying by the piece is a very good way of combating gender wage inequality. Because the alternative is that people end up getting paid according to some degree of custom. And particularly in the past, the custom was that men were paid more than women. There is still some elements of that today, but it's less true than it was in the past. And so what we found actually is that paying by the piece was the best thing that could happen to women, because then these were cigar workers, they all got paid the same, whether they were male or female. If you produced 32 cigars, you got paid the same wage, irrespective of your gender. The second thing then that we get are profit-related pay, which again was even tried in the university sector 25 years ago. I remember being on profit-related pay when I taught at Royal Holloway, and the profits were preset 7 years in advance. I was employed by Royal Holloway Enterprise, a profit-making company, that then hired me out to Royal Holloway College in order to take advantage of a tax break on profit-related pay. So you always have to be careful of these things. What we've done then in the case of performance-related pay is we have delegated it to heads and governing bodies to decide what elements of performance count. And it's entirely up to your head and your governing body, and in the case of maintained schools with interaction with your local authority, what you count. So I know one school near me, for example, that's putting a lot of weight on how much CPD teachers engage in and how supportive they are of other teachers. Because it argues that they don't believe that performance in the classroom is this particular school. They do not believe that that sort of performance-related pay is effective. They don't want teachers to be paid by test results, because they're worried that teachers will then teach to the test. That seems a perfectly plausible thing to worry about. They're also concerned that making inspection visits to school classrooms could increase the degree of pressure on teachers. So they've come up with a package of things that the school community as a whole have bought into that they do want to reward. And they argue that this is better than just paying on longevity, because we know that beyond the first couple of years, there's very little evidence that just being a more experienced teacher per se makes you a better teacher. And performance-related pay, as opposed to payment by results, gives schools and governors the flexibility to work out what is needed in their school. So you should see it as an opportunity rather than being compelled to do something that we have dictated from on high.
The question was about what's the evidence.
Oh yeah, sorry. So if you send me your evidence links again, because I haven't seen the letter you've been sent, I'm happy to engage with you directly. But is it the case that every policy is evidence-based? Of course not. And nor should it be. We don't live in a technocracy. And sometimes the only way to create an evidence base is to try it. Now, of course, as a social scientist, I would rather everything was piloted. But it takes a long time to pilot most things. And to stand up and say to a politician, take the pupil premium plus for children who are adopted or children who are in care. How long will it take us, or the pupil premium itself, to get a fully worked through view of whether that works? Well, it'll take the duration that a child is in education. So since we're now having an early years pupil premium, that's from 3 until 18. So to say to a minister, well, I'd like a pilot to start with 3-year-olds, and I will tell you in 15 years' time, plus another 2 years for academics to analyse it, whether it's worked, and then we'll roll it out, that's not feasible. Nor is it necessarily morally right either to politicians who have a democratic mandate or to the children concerned. So it's perfectly legitimate for politicians to make decisions without an evidence base, but my job is to ensure that they are given the evidence base that we have. And that's why the more evidence that you send me, the more evidence I can show to ministers, and the more likely it is that a higher proportion of decisions are made based on a strong evidence base. Yeah. Sorry, hang on.
The
I
policy
can't hear you.
dictates that we have to find distinctions between individual teachers. The policy states that.
Yeah.
So that would seem to need an evidence base also. So you haven't given me any evidence. I can't find any. The department's not giving me any evidence. And what you've got now is we can decide what we want to do. But actually, we can't decide what we want to do. We certainly can't decide not to do it. And we have to decide to distinguish between one teacher and another.
But this is no change. There was never an evidence base to show that over the first 6 years that a teacher was on main scale, they got better by this percentage each year. There was never an evidence base for what went before. So it's not that we've gone backward in any sense. What we've allowed you to do is think through the needs of your school locally, to think locally, what is the evidence that we are missing in our school? What behaviours do we wish to reward locally? And as I say, there are issues like CPD that can be structured if you think all your teachers are equally good, or more specifically, that the current ratio of pay of your teachers that will have grown up for a lot of historic reasons is an accurate reflection of the contributions of those people to your school. If you as a governing body really believe that's true and believe that all people are contributing equally, you can set up a schema that will deliver that outcome.
So in conclusion, there's no evidence base. I'm involved in a process of research.
Sorry, there's no evidence.
In conclusion, there's no evidence base for performance-related pay for teachers. Actually, what I'm involved in is a piece of research.
Yes, well, whether you're involved in the research is a different issue. If you want to be involved in research on that, then again, you want to be talking to groups, because unless you're being evaluated compared to other people, you're not part of research. Research has to be drawing together other people where the contributions are presented. And yes, if you're willing to do that, I would be delighted. There was a lady at the front. And who's going to be next? Then we can hopefully send the microphone up there, otherwise. And then there'll be a lady in the middle. Otherwise, this poor lady ends up running backwards and forwards. And then she can at least walk at her leisure. And then we'll have the man in the middle. I have to be careful not to come too close to the edge, or else we might need a new chief analyst.
Hi, I'm Ruth Boyask,
Yep.
and I am the convener of the BERA Social Justice Special Interest Group.
Yep.
First, I'd just like to say that I'm very appreciative of this opportunity to have this conversation. We're currently involved in a project within the Social Justice SIG, leading a group of other SIGs within BERA called Respecting Children and Young People. And what we're doing within this project is drawing together the best and the brightest research from BERA around issues of equality and how they may impact on children and young people. I think, you know, one of the things we're finding in doing this project is that a lot of people are saying the similar kinds of things as an outcome of their research. However, a lot of the research that we're drawing upon is not the kind of longitudinal research that you've mentioned. It's not mixed methods research, and there is a lot of it which is qualitative research. However, you know, the massive evidence seems to be saying similar sorts of things. And I'm just wondering to what extent that kind of initiative, this kind of evidence is of interest to you and the work that you're doing.
Yeah. I mean, I can answer that both personally and in general and institutionally. So personally, my PhD is in economics. I am quantitatively trained, that's who I am. But I also teach history. And I know as a historian that life is messy and that we look at words as much as numbers. And certainly when I've been looking at, apprenticeship in the Elizabethan era, there's a lot of words compared with the number of numbers that I ever find. So from my point of view, I am inherently a mixed methods person. I much prefer to triangulate evidence from different sources. And I think that's true for the department as a whole. There are very few entirely qualitative studies or entirely quantitative studies that I've seen that are as strong as ones that combine both. However, if you are, so one challenge I'd say to you is it really the case that you can only have qualitative studies, particularly if you're doing a synthesis and you have a large network? Is it really the case that there aren't good quantitative researchers out there that you could reach out to? Because if you can, I think you will have a stronger and more influential product. Now, having said that, because you're doing a synthesis and there's a big mass of evidence, that is a lot stronger than one research paper. Because one of the difficulties of doing qualitative research is it's very expensive and very slow. I mean, you all know that, we all know that. That's the way of qualitative research. It takes a heck of a long time to do it. And that means that an individual paper based on a very small sample it's really unlikely to change the world. But when you put them all together as you are doing, that's then very interesting. So I think what you're doing is particularly important in qualitative work because you're gathering that mass together and presenting it in a coherent framework. So yes, keep going. Thank you. And then we'll have the gentleman here. Yep.
Okay. Bronwyn Maxwell from Sheffield Hallam University.
Hello.
I just wanted to kind of turn it round a little bit, rather than thinking about academic research and policy and practice, to think of it from the schools, particularly upwards. And I, as a lot of other people here, do a lot of work with schools in terms of evidence-based research and development and supported national projects. And I'm seeing in the school-led system a much clearer link with school improvement, much more collaboration across schools to use evidence as best they can and to undertake research and development. But in all the kind of meetings, that includes national projects I'm involved in, it's the elephant in the room is, so what about the knowledge in that very dispersed school system? And I'd just really like to know what the DfE's understanding of how that might come together. You know, are we just depending on the ripple effect? Is it people like Research Ed? What is it? Because when I talk to schools, they always go back to this traditional dissemination ideas, which actually we know don't work in terms of CPD. So where's the DfE position?
So the DfE position is that this is for schools to decide, ultimately. So we, in that sense, are neutral, but we are supportive of different ways of doing it. So a number of things that we are keen on, for example, would be teaching school alliances. One of the points of teaching school alliances are to encourage knowledge to transfer. That's one of the ideas. One of the attractions of chain academies or multi-academy trusts or umbrella trusts is to disseminate knowledge. So I went back to my old school recently, which is in charge of what I think is an umbrella trust, because years and years ago, the local authority had a school that was problematic, and they asked it to do some work with them. And that's great. The school of which I was a governor has now got an executive head who covers 2 schools. And they're 2 schools that are just far enough apart that they're not in competition. So there's none of that sort of, am I doing my own school in? But they're close enough that it's only half an hour or 20 minutes between them. And they're schools with very similar intakes. And this school was helped by this head when this head began. This head's now retired, and this head's doing really great stuff. So she's now been appointed executive head here. And what we don't have a DfE policy saying that if you are within 1.8 miles, then you must do X, Y, and Z. We're keen to just facilitate that sort of thing happening. And something like Research Ed is a good example of that. DfE could not create something like Research Ed. I mean, what was it? It was, they're doing a small conference coming up in December, which I seem to recall is £15 plus £1.55 booking fee. You can't escape the booking fees, even for Research Ed. And the big one in September, which unfortunately I couldn't get to, was only 40 quid. And yeah, I mean, let's be honest here, the BERA conference cost £400. Government never creates something that costs 40 quid. If government created a conference that was on a Saturday, there might be a hoo-ha about whether we were expecting teachers to give up a Saturday. But if Research Ed does it, and it's a group of teachers and others who really want to be there, then it's organic and it's self-developed. And we think that's much more likely to be effective. Now, CPD, I think, is a big elephant in the room. What is the purpose of CPD? Because the guy at the back said he didn't seem very impressed by what is essentially CPD for governors. He didn't sound as though he really got a lot out of the session. And when you talk to teachers, they're often pretty sceptical about some of the CPD they get. So, is there a role for people to think more imaginatively about CPD? Yes, I think there is. Do I think DfE are the best people to think imaginatively about? No. I mean, you're shaking your head, and you and I agree on, no, you're allowed to shake your head. We're doing our best in DfE to know our limitations. And the final thing is well, what we would call a Royal College of Teaching. I don't think we should say it's royal, because obviously we don't have any permission for that. But some sort of college of teaching, somewhere where teachers come together. And we've had all sorts of plans, and none of them have quite got over the line. And I think ministers would love it. We can't create a college of teaching, almost by definition. The DfE cannot create that. It has to come from the profession. And we haven't quite got there. And it's not annoying, that would be wrong. I'm not criticising anyone here, but we would just love it if it happened, because then they could answer your question, and they would answer it much better than I will ever be able to answer it, because your question is really important. So no, I don't think we're quite there. We're at a world that is, as you say, very, very messy. And a college of teaching, I think, would give that some coherence, and I very much hope it happens. We'll see. Fingers crossed. Right, the gentleman in the middle. Who wants to be after the gentleman in the middle? And then there are two people behind. We'll go backwards.
Tim, thank you very much. The picture you portrayed is a very positive one and very impressive. It sort of suggests that we're living in a world of hyper-rationality and policy being made to a highly logical and evidence-based process, with the implications that sort of somehow ideology is not in there.
Oh, I didn't go that far.
Well, okay.
Politicians have an electoral mandate and a set of priors, and they are entitled to that.
And, sorry, my name is Paul Morris, I work here. The use of the research by the government, often in my area, which is comparative education, has essentially often been highly expedient, highly selective, and is essentially raided data in a highly pick-and-mix fashion. And sometimes wholly distorted data to promote their preferred policies. So, I mean, how do you sort of put yourself in a situation when actually the policies bear very little resemblance to what the evidence is saying? And if I take an important example...
Give me an example.
Well, the 2010 white paper.
That's a big risk on my part, because I let you choose the
2010
example.
white paper was based on two sort of main platforms, saying that we're falling behind the rest of the world, right, based on PISA data. That's factually inaccurate anyway. Based on PISA data, and we're going to promote more school autonomy, have more academies, more free schools, and we're going to create sort of multiple routes into teacher education and not require necessarily teachers to be trained in academies. Now, both of those propositions are actually not supported by the international evidence on which they claim they derive those conclusions. So how do you, well, that's more of a statement, but I'll try and turn it into a question.
Indeed. Well, I was thinking
how do you, who's promoting evidence-based policy, reconcile, this sort of, does the minister have a tray for stuff that doesn't confirm his own existing preferences?
Well, of course, the Secretary of State is now a woman, so we're not just talking about him, and I think it is fantastic to see women doing well in politics. There are a number of issues there. Firstly, sorry, did someone hiss me for that one, or did I just... Blimey, hissed for supporting women? Wow, that would be a change. So there are a number of different issues here. Firstly, can ministers misuse data? Now, for that, we have Sir Andrew Dilnot, formerly head of the IFS, now head of the UK Statistics Authority. And it is his job, if ministers say something that is not correct, substantively not correct, to criticise them. And that is a job that I think Andrew does very well. And if you have any complaints of that nature, it is to Andrew you must write. And I, as chief analyst, would rather be in Andrew's good books, and I've known Andrew for 20 plus years. I would rather be in his good books than that of any politician. And that is how I reconcile it. That is my job as a civil servant, to give ministers honest data that stand up to public scrutiny. So Andrew Dilnot is the head of the UK Statistics Authority. Sir Andrew Dilnot.
Criticised the DfE's press release on the last PISA round.
I know, but that's why I'm pointing out. I'm sorry, I've forgotten your name. Paul. That's why I'm pointing out to Paul. We have democratic checks and balances that are there to ensure that ministers cannot say that black is white if black is indeed black. Now, do ministers always do this deliberately? No, my experience is they don't. They have remembered, particularly if you're live in an interview, they have remembered a factoid that they believe is true and they repeat it. I did this myself once on Newsnight. I was being interviewed about female labour market participation, something on which I have written extensively, and I said I believed correctly that the current recession was different because for the first time ever, women made up a majority of people in work. And I said that on Newsnight. Nobody picked me up on it, but it's not true. I discovered 3 months later that actually my figure referred to people who were in employment rather than in work, and that actually the self-employed are overwhelmingly male, and self-employment is now such a big share that once you included them, my figure that there are more women than men in work is simply not true. So had I been a minister, Andrew Dilnot would have written to me, I'm sure, and tell me off. Now, I think he would have understood that that was said on the spur of the moment, that I genuinely believed it was true. And his job is to decide whether ministers are making an inadvertent, and not legitimate mistake, but an honest mistake, or whether they're actually trying to mislead the public. And when he believes the second, the consequences are more severe. And Andrew is, he's a serious person. You do not want to mess with Andrew Dilnot. You really don't. And politicians have known Andrew for many years from when he was head of the IFS and picked them up on financial statements that they made. And it's good that we have those checks and balances. That's why we have an impartial civil service and things like UKSA. Now then, on the substantive position, do we in government, does the Secretary of State, both the current and the previous one, believe that our PISA performance is good enough? No, they don't. And nor should they. You know, we're somewhere in the middle, roughly. And as far as we can tell, we're roughly where we have been for a long time. There isn't a lot of evidence in PISA to show that we're going in the direction that I think everybody in Britain would want us to go. And I think that is a legitimate position for politicians as individuals, as a political party, or as a nation to take. Now, I've forgotten the... you had a question about... What was your final point? You asked a long question. It was too long for me to remember.
I think you've sort of swerved away from my question there. I didn't say...
Well, I've given you the chance to come back.
PISA results were not important. I said that the inferences made about high-performing systems that were the basis of the 2010 white paper
about accountability and autonomy.
Were invalid and not correct.
Well, you can say that, but in that case you're disagreeing with Andreas Schleicher. He's been very clear.
No, I'm sorry. A lot of Schleicher's conclusions go down the same route as well. Sorry?
A lot of?
Schleicher's conclusions go down the same route. They too were ignored. Right? I mean, one of Schleicher's conclusions, the OECD's, was the sort of competition that operates in UK schools with the league tables and autonomy and competition was not associated with high performance.
That's not what Andreas told me when I saw him about a week ago.
Read his report.
Well, I have read his reports. So we're just going to have to agree to disagree on what Andreas has said, but we can I think even Catherine even has the quotes, because this is something we're often accused of saying. So we can read you out quotes from Andreas Schleicher. If you want to write to me and say, can you provide me with a quote from Andreas Schleicher saying autonomy is generally a good thing, then yes, we can, for sure. And that is my perception of Andreas's general position. So we will have to agree to disagree on what the evidence base says. There was the gentleman behind, and then behind again.
My name is Benny, and as the gentleman above, I've been working in schools for almost a decade, and currently I'm a PhD student. I seem to get a mixed message from you, and it kind of follows from the previous question. You seem to say, give a conflicting message that policies are sometimes based on evidence, and other times the politicians have the freedom to satisfy electoral mandate or whatever. However, we have seen, it appears to suggest that evidence does not have any place in policy making, as we have seen with the previous Secretary of State for Education. Now, in the program sheet, it says the department wants to raise standards, narrow the gap, and protect the vulnerable. Are you saying that it is essentially what the DfE is doing? Because I'm looking at learning mentors in primary schools, which was part of the EIC, which had a couple of $100 million spent on it. And I have presented at BERA and at ESA, at the European Education Research Conference, and people seem to be surprised to hear that there is some professionals called learning mentors. Why is it that the profession or an initiative which attracted so much money has been forgotten? And so how are you justifying that your view that evidence-based policies still exist convinces?
Right, so let me be really clear about the basis of democracy. Democracy gives politicians a democratic mandate. That's clear. That's clear in all democracies. That's been true forever and a day. It's true for the current government and all previous governments. All ministers have the right to ignore evidence. The civil service's job is to give ministers good advice. Ministers are allowed to set an agenda. No, let me finish, because you said I wasn't clear last time. They are allowed, the civil service job is to give good advice to ministers. Ministers then have the right to ignore the civil service, and that is right and proper. It is right that we live in a democracy, that we don't live in some yes minister world. Now, if they go too far, the Permanent Secretary writes what is called an accounting letter to say that what you are doing is so far removed from any reasonable thing that we believe any person would want to do. And I believe those are public. They're not issued very often because very few ministers go that far. So that's how democracy works. So it's my job as chief analyst to put the best evidence in front of ministers, because I believe as a social scientist that the better the evidence I can put in front of ministers, the more likely it is that they will take notice of that evidence. So if there's a meta-study done on 101 different qualitative studies, then I can say, look, here is a huge evidence base on this. When we've got something like a longitudinal study, which is really a very good quality evidence base, that's the sort of thing that, in my experience, all ministers are interested in. Now, of course, if you think about something like the EPI study, those kids are now, what, they're 17? Yeah, they're 17. So we're talking about what, kids who were age 3, 14 years ago, and the world has changed in 14 years. So you have to, the evidence base is never perfect that says you must do X. Hardy and Cartwright's book on will it work somewhere else is very applicable. And that's a judgment that ministers have the right to make. Now, you said, how can a policy be forgotten? I wasn't sure, forgotten by whom?
By the department.
Forgotten in what sense?
By the sense that even yesterday I presented at BERA, and people were surprised, oh, are they still there? Why? Why is it that primary schools in England are not familiar with something that I have found in my research to be really, really effective?
Well, that's a question for primary schools. That's not a question for the government. We have a school-led funding system where we fund schools overwhelmingly and they decide what to do with their money. So it's for primary schools to decide whether they believe the evidence base.
But there's no money.
Well, they have the budget they have for everything else. It's up to them how they divide their budget up. We don't have a spare pot of gold sitting in the department where we're just sitting on. We give it all to schools. Believe me, one thing I can guarantee you is ministers fight very hard for a bigger budget, as do ministers in every department for their services. So it's entirely up to schools whether they believe it. And that's why we believe in a school-led system. As this lady here said, how do schools learn from each other? How do they learn about projects that you've done? It's by going to things like Research Ed, and then they hear about you, and they engage with that evidence base, and they make the decisions. That's what it means to have a school-led system. You can shake your head, but that's the policy.
That's exactly what the politicians and bureaucrats are trying to do. You can shake your head as much as you want. You can present us with whatever evidence you have, but as you said, blame or riding on that democratic responsibility or whatever mandate, they try to do whatever they want to do.
No, that's quite the reverse of what I was saying, with all due respect. What I was saying is teachers have the choice. I'm not blaming anyone. I'm saying teachers have the decision as to how to spend their money. That's a decision that they have, and the government does believe, in our view, supported by the OECD and others, that that is the way forward, that is the best way to deliver a successful education system. Now, you can say it's wrong. You can argue that DfE should dictate that all schools must send X percentage of their money on this and Y percentage of their money on that. And obviously you're welcome to stand for election on that basis. That's how democracy works. Sorry, the person behind.
Yeah, I had a question. On your slide it says DfE research priorities and partnerships. And I've heard a lot about your priorities in terms of what you want to receive and what you're interested in. But I haven't heard very much about partnerships, and so I'd like to hear a bit more about that. And I also wondered if there's any opportunities, for policy and recommendations that might be politically controversial. And I can give you an example if you like.
Yeah, go on.
A return to looking at the situation of home education and the number of children that drop out of school because of issues within school, but actually the underpinning issue is racism, and I'm thinking particularly of Gypsy, Roma, traveller children.
Yeah, I think there would be an interest in that. They are the Gypsy, Roma and Irish traveller children are the lowest performing identified group by some margin on just, I think probably on every measure that we have. So I think if there were, yeah, I think ministers would and the civil service would be interested in ideas about how we can make that no longer true. I don't think that, I mean, it depends on what you're going to suggest as to whether your ideas are controversial, but...
Well, one of the reasons is that the home education system provides a legal loophole,
Yeah.
if you like, for children to drop out of school. And that is quite often,
Yeah.
you know, an easy
Yeah.
way out for the school and the family.
Yeah.
And so there is certainly evidence on the
Yes.
increasing number of take-up and consequently the you know, lowering of qualifications because there's less in school.
Yeah. So this wasn't actually in my box, but I saw it going through. But last year, I think we consulted on changing rules on school attendance for some groups. Now, I can't remember which groups that, maybe somebody else remembers what our consultation was on. If so, they should shout out. But I know we had a consultation on changing the law on school attendance. So actually, I think that is a perfectly live issue. I'm embarrassed to say that I can't remember exactly what we were consulting on or what the result of the consultation was. But I do remember it was it was a very open consultation because it was an area where we wanted to know what the wider world thought and knew about a topic that at one level is very small, in that the number of these children is relatively small, but is really important for those children. And that's why we consulted on it. So I don't think your point is at all controversial. I think it's a legitimate point that can and should be made. It's part of what it means to have a democratic
You're genuinely
system.
interested in hearing about people approaching you for issues that might, well, you know, might in the, you know, up and coming election.
Yeah, of course. We always want to know an evidence base. So if you have a good evidence base about that, yes, of course we want to hear from you. And in terms of partnerships, our partnerships take place at a number of levels. So, for example, we've had an ongoing partnership with the people who did the EPSI study. And that partnership has now gone on for, I don't know, it must be the best part of 15 years. That's a long partnership. We're doing work at the moment on the factors determining underachievement of children with Anna Vignoles from the University of Cambridge. That's an ongoing partnership. We have the Longitudinal Survey of Young People of England 2 has an academic advisory board. So again, there are partnerships there. So there are lots of partnerships like that we have, as well as more organised ones with people like the Fisher Family Trust, who also do contract work for us. So yeah, so there's a whole bunch of them with, yeah. There are some academics who find they spend too long in DfE head office and we're desperate to get back to their own research. But they have such expertise, we keep ringing them up and we keep leaning on them a little and they say, oh, okay, because they know they have something to tell us and they know we want to listen to them. Yep, let's have the lady here and then the lady there. So we'll make this poor lady run up and down. And then we'll have the lady on the front row of the next section.
Deborah Malpass, AQA. This government has introduced a lot of reforms to the exam systems for 14 to 19-year-olds.
Yep.
GCSEs, A-levels and vocational and apprenticeships. Is there actually a timeline for the evaluation of all of these reforms?
I don't think there is at the moment.
Because I'm looking in your research priorities paper, and it doesn't look like there is.
Well, the research priorities papers are general issues that we are interested in, rather than necessarily research that we would commission. I mean, a lot of that comes under Ofqual rather than us. So it would depend what you mean by an evaluation of them. I mean, at one level, it's a technical thing. Are the exams delivered? And, you know, thanks to the good work of you and your colleagues, you know, exams are being delivered. New curriculum are out there. So some research is not, in some sense, necessary to do the research. You know, the kids will take the papers, they will get the results they get. It's for then Ofqual to do work on the validity, etc., of the exams. And they have a whole bunch of people. In fact, we have had some research delayed recently because the number of psychometricians in Britain is very low. And
Yes.
2 of them are pregnant. And so we recently had to send a note to minister saying the research the minister wanted done couldn't be done because 2 of the psychometricians were pregnant and we couldn't find someone to replace them. You know, there are some things for which you can get maternity leave cover, but there are no spare psychometricians sitting around. And it's at points like that where I'm glad I am a historian as well as an economist, because you are really remember that individuals matter. So the question is, what do you mean by, is this programme successful? What would be your measures of success?
Well, I think, well, there's lots of different measures, isn't there? But I mean, what are the ones that are important to DfE? Because obviously for us as an awarding body, it would be about reliability of marking and that kind of thing. But what about sort of wider sort of social policy issues about the outcomes for people of different social classes, that kind of thing?
So that research we do, or different social classes we can't do because we don't know the social class of every child in school. So for example, we don't know who their parents are. We don't have national insurance numbers. So we have only much cruder estimates, such as either their postcode, which is some sort of loose proxy for their likely social class, or, and we have it at 6 digits, obviously, we have the full postcode, or their status for things like free school meals. But it's not proper, we can't do proper social stratification. But we can do it at sort of FSM versus non-FSM, and that's something that ministers always look at. I mean, especially in the current government, because we have the pupil premium and the big emphasis on the attainment of pupil premium children. We also do it by ethnicity, which is gone, including that of Gypsy, Roma and Irish traveller children. So we will look at what happens to the average grades of these groups. Absolutely. That, you can take that as, that's a read my lips moment.
So I think our sort of concern in the assessment community is that this kind of wholesale reform is similar to sort of the change from O-levels to GCSE, which had a 10-year lead in, and we've had 18 months.
Yeah, but I mean, you've delivered it very successfully. We could argue that shows that 10 years was more than was needed for the lead-in towards GCSEs. I mean, you can argue that one both ways. I think you and your colleagues have done a genuinely superb job. I really do that. And, and it really is for Ofqual to answer the questions about reliability and validity. And if Ofqual thought we were going too fast and they could not secure the reliability and validity of exams, then I think anybody who's ever met Glenys Stacey will know that she would be perfectly capable of writing to the Secretary of State of the day, whoever they would be. Glenys is not a woman who has fear or favour of anyone, and say that what you are doing is putting the exam system at risk. And one thing that you at AQA were very clear with us a couple of years ago was that early entry, particularly in maths, was putting reliability and validity at stake. I remember a conversation with very serious people in AQA who were telling me that the big increase in the number of people doing maths, particularly younger and younger children, was making it very hard for you to work out, basically, whether the questions were getting harder or the candidates less good. And that's really problematic. I'm an examiner as well. That's really hard. And you came to us with your concerns, and we took your concerns very seriously. And if you came to us and said, we think this reform is going so fast that we cannot guarantee the reliability of the exams, we would take that just as seriously as we did when you came to us about early entry. And I say, I can prove that one because we did take you seriously in that case. There are a few cases where I can say I can prove this one, but that one I can. But we'll definitely do it by social class, ethnicity, etc. Definitely. Do we have a next question so I can point to them already? Yes, over on this side. Sorry, you've probably been waving at me for a while. It's a classic thing of talking to the centre of the audience rather than what is to me the extreme right wing.
I've got two questions. My name is Gemma Moss and I work here at the Institute of Education, and I know I'm not going to bowl them at you. So I will
ask me one first
I'm
and then the other
hovering
one,
on
because I have a
which
terrible
one
memory.
matters most. What I've been listening to in the room is a lot about the difficulties of getting a good relationship between research practitioners, policymakers. There is a big literature on the problems of getting those relationships working well, and I think you'd have to be signally uninformed not to appreciate the problem. And what you've been telling us is about the problem from your end and some of the potential solutions. One of the phrases that's come up in what you've said, Tim, is about moving to a school-led system. And I think that produces particular dilemmas in the relationship between research and education when universities are also stepping away from the role they used to have in delivering ITT. So if we roll back to a time before the state got involved with doing large-scale policy reform, universities trained teachers, they inducted them into research cultures, and then they sent them out into schools. One of the key sort of structural dimensions within the education system that's changed is those relationships have become much more fraught, and that then kind of creates, it means that a lot of the responsibility that you're outlining under your phrase school-led rests with the head. and it rests internal to an individual school. If you're lucky, it may have a bigger partnership. I'm just wondering if you can say something about what you see as the risks to the thinning of some of those relationships under the current setup that you've been signalling to us.
I don't accept the premise that there has been a thinning of the relationship between universities and schools. Actually, if anything, I think the relationship has been strengthened in many ways. So, first of all, the vast majority of ITT people are still having an interaction with a university, either directly through a PGCE or through School Direct, most of which have a university partner. Indeed, I think I'm right in saying, I was about to go out on a limb, but not quite literally, I think I'm right in saying that more people will be trained by the IOE this year through School Direct or PGC than at any point in the IOE's history. And actually, what's really interesting to me is the partnership that School Direct offers between a school as a corporate entity and a body like the IOE. So let's take a really specific example, which is Furs Platt School in Maidenhead. And I picked that one because an old friend of mine is deputy head there. And they've gone into School Direct this time and they held a beauty contest, essentially, between the IOE, and this has a happy outcome for the IOE, and various other potential university partners. And they said that in the old days, individual teachers, so my friend Edwin went to Hull for his teacher training, my wife went to Nottingham, etc. So he had a relationship with Hull, my wife had one with Nottingham, but their relationship with their trainer essentially ended on the day they left. Whereas he views the IOE as a long-term strategic partner now for Furs Platts. So his view is that the new school-led, school-direct system is a more powerful connection between a university and his school, where he wants an ongoing dialogue. And I can easily imagine in the future that extending beyond ITT. That actually the IOE would write to Edwin and say, "Dear Edwin, you took a whole bunch of our kids 5 years ago. Now is actually the time when they need to be doing some leadership programs, where they need to be thinking about this, that, and t'other." And actually the IOE then... oh, sorry. Oh, death comes to us all. That actually the IOE then becomes an ongoing strategic partner with Furs Platt School. And one of the reasons they picked the IOE was that it wasn't about brand name or anything like that, although obviously the IOE has a serious brand name. It was about that sense that the IOE was in it for the long haul and went beyond just initial teacher training. So actually, I think the opportunities for universities are huge. Now, will they all take up these opportunities? No, of course not. We've seen some universities' numbers have shot up because they're entrepreneurial, they're, whatever you want to call it. And others have declined because, well, whatever reason, they have chosen not to engage in the new process. And it's not my job in DfE to tell universities to engage in a programme. That is their right as freestanding bodies. Now, have some pulled out? Yes. But not so many that I'm worried about the university sector's involvement in ITT.
I mean, you come back with a very clear description of the opportunities, and in a way what I was wanting to signal was risks. I heard a paper this morning about clinical informed practice as it's developing in the University of Melbourne, which is borrowed the notion of diagnosis as standing at the heart of professional judgment, and then wants to model for its trainee teachers not this is the thing you do, now go do it, but this is the dilemma the classroom sets you. What are the resources that you have to bring to it, so that it's some of the changes around teacher training. For instance, if you go via the Teach First partnerships, you get all of the dilemmas in classrooms very, very quick, and maybe not much of the resource. So that there are other when one thing shifts, other things happens. And in a way, this takes me back to what it was, the kind of conversation that was happening around the question from AQA. It's, there's the law of intended and unintended consequences. And it's kind of, one way of managing the risk element, not the opportunity element, is to try and track it very closely through research.
So one thing I would love is to be able to link teachers much more closely with pupils. As a social scientist, I would love to be able to do that. Now, that has traditionally proven very difficult. I understand, mainly because the classroom unions are very worried about how it may be misused in a sort of performance-related pay system. And I understand their worries, but it still saddens me. And actually here, I think the most interesting work on Teach First was by Becky Allen and someone else whose name I've forgotten, which is a really bad thing. I don't think it was Simon in this case. But she showed, to her surprise, that Teach First was effective. She had not expected it to be effective, but she found, and she couldn't work out who'd been taught by the Teach Firster, but she could look at departments that had a Teach Firster in them and correct for as many other things as she could. And she found, to her surprise, that actually Teach First was effective. And as I say, if we had better connections, then we could better work out whether teachers who'd been trained through different routes were more effective. And I think next summer we will have for the first time the school direct employment data. I think that comes out next summer. And then we'll know, for example, how many people who have been trained are in work. And that's, it's not a great indicator of how good a teacher they are, but it does at least show they're in employment. If 2/3 of them are not in employment, then, Houston, we have a problem. In the medium term, we should want to know how quickly do they get promoted? Do they go on to take leadership positions? That will be an interesting variable. Should we be doing that research? You bet. And actually, the school workforce census pretty much allows us to do that. But it's getting the connection between that in particular, for me as a quantitative person, to the National Pupil Database that is difficult, particularly at student level. I mean, boy, do I wish it wasn't. Now, was that both of your questions before I let the lady with the mic? Ah, there we are. Generosity on the part of the questioners.
I'm Nicholas Wollaston. I have 20 years of experience as a primary practitioner, but I'm now a PhD student here, and my area of research is in calculation strategies taught in primary schools.
Yes.
My question goes back to the triangle, if you like, between ministers, policy and the electorate.
Yep.
And that you quite clearly point out that ministers feel they have a democratic mandate sometimes to impose their ideology as policy, regardless of what the research might be suggesting. And I'm thinking particularly in terms of calculation policy, because that's my area of interest. And my question to you is, in terms of completing this sort of love triangle, what role does the DfE have in educating the electorate about research and its findings in order to help them support the right mandate, as it were?
Well, that's a very easy question to answer, because the answer is none, except in that we produce facts. So we do produce some analysis and we publish it, but it's not... You look at the opinion polls and ask them, do people naturally trust government, the church, etc.? And these numbers are all going down over time. And so I don't think we would see ourselves as having... It's not that people are going to start rushing out to the gov.uk/education website to read the latest research from us. Sadly, that may be for all of us. So we would see ours as facilitating other people to do so. And above all, we would see that as academics. And that's why people like, I actually before... In fact, no, it was after I joined. I actually came and taught on one of the IOE programs about how to influence civil society, because it's really important. And that's something LSE is, if I may blow the trumpet of my own university for a moment, while on the DfE payroll, is something that's very good at. LSE is very serious about influence. So it provides media training for everyone. It provides, if you found something interesting, they'll work with you to try and get it out, LSE blogs, etc. Because we would see that as being mediated by all sorts of people along the way. So by people like the TES, by The Guardian, mentioned in the previous session, and the Daily Mail, mentioned in the previous session as well, which the audience almost hissed. It was clearly put up as a swear word. But actually there are lots of bodies like that. Now, where we are keen on working with those partners is usually in a sort of, as a backseat passenger. So Save the Children is doing some really good work on literacy and numeracy that you've probably seen. And they, I understand, I think this is retrospective, no, I'm going to be careful here. They are working with a major national newspaper on this, major in terms of circulation, one that reaches out to parts of the community that certainly don't read government press releases. And since I don't know if they've already done it, I would ask you all not to tweet that immediately unless you've actually seen it. And that for us is really exciting. But they are in a better position to deliver that as Save the Children. They have a brand name that is credible in a way that people otherwise always worry that government ministers lent very hard on Catherine and Susanna and me to say the right thing. Whereas if it's Save the Children or academics, people don't have that view. So you're in a much better position to lead this, and you must. And I'm just relieved. I thought you were going to ask me what 7/8 are, because as I understand it, that is the hardest one, and I know it's 56. And as soon as you said that, I thought, shit, he's going to ask me 7/8. And the only way I can ever remember 7/8 is to know that 8/8 are 64, which I just know really deeply and profoundly. And then I subtract 8 and thus get to 56. Otherwise, I can never remember if it's 54 or 56. I know it's... Yeah.
7 times 7 is the one that you need to learn, because all the others you can extrapolate.
Yes. Yes. No, 7 sevens being 49, I know perfectly. I don't know why. I know all my squares. So the other answer I occasionally give when asked 7/8 in a public place is it's 55 plus or minus 1. Hey, you know, how many significant figures do we have to be correct to?
But essentially your answer is no.
No, absolutely. It's, apart from producing facts. So we produce a lot of facts. So I believe tomorrow we have more statistical first releases coming out on the phonics check. The Key Stage 2 results, the statistical first release was out reasonably recently. We take the figures from AQA, etc., and we aggregate them to publish GCSE results. And that's really important. And of course, we participate in things like PISA. I mean, that costs a lot of money. I seem to recall that I have to sign a cheque for just over £1 million a year or something to administer PISA. You know, that's a big contribution to the evidence base. And the other way we do it is to make our data available at individual pupil level to academic researchers. So I think it was David Miliband who created the National Pupil Database, a colleague told me. If it is, I think a statue should be erected in his honour somewhere, because it takes years for something like that to actually have any value, but he laid down those foundations. And people like Becky Allen here at the IOE or Simon Burgess or the team at the IFS, they've produced some outstanding research that they couldn't have done without us. And their research has then informed. That paper I mentioned earlier on universal infant free school meals was predicated on being able to get the Key Stage 2 results that we compile and release to researchers. And that's one of the things that I'm really proud we have done better recently, is we've got better at giving out data. So at this year's National Pupil Database User Conference in Bristol, Richard Lumley, who's in charge of giving it out, explained how he was trying to make it quicker. And Ellen Greaves, and he had a quote saying from a researcher who said, wow, it really is working, with a smiley face. And he said, I got this as an email. And Ellen Greaves from the IFS put up her hand and said, yes, I sent that email. And the whole room burst out into applause. And I can assure you, civil servants are not used to sudden spontaneous applause from academics. And Richard went the reddest shade I've ever seen a civil servant go. And I was really pleased for him and really proud of him, because it is the level of engagement that we should be having. But not directly, no. That was the longest-winded no you've ever heard. Good job it's not a timed exam, isn't it?
Thanks. Hi, I'm Colleen and I'm from Essex University. My PhD looks at the latest RPA policy, and it's examining the outcomes of the RPA and looking at it from the perspective of level 1 learners and level 1 FE teachers. I suppose one of my...
Level 1 learners and level 1?
FE lecturers, the lecturers teaching them, so sort of looking at their narratives, etc. What I wanted to know is, my data is showing up that there's confused logics, within the Department for Education in terms of it's bringing out, the RPA policy, but then it brings out, other policies like the Nutt-Brown report that is, unfortunately, with these learners, resulting in them not participating but withdrawing because of the raised educational standards that's going on, that's been raised, in the early education sector. Would you even take notice of a paper that is pointing out contradictions within policies? And firstly, the contradictions, and secondly, it's done by a PhD student. And
we don't care who does it. There was a lovely piece in the FT earlier this week by Lucy Kellaway on why are the brightest people in firms always aged less than 25, which was a nice piece, since I'm pretty sure Lucy is now in her 50s. Yeah, we don't care about your status. It doesn't matter that I'm chief analyst. There are lots of people in DfE who know far more about almost every issue than I do, not least because I have to cover every single issue. You have devoted how many years of your life to your PhD?
You don't want to know.
No, I don't, and certainly as an academic,
4 or 5
if it's
years,
that long.
yeah.
Yeah, of course you know more stuff than I will know, or almost certainly anybody else in the rest of the world knows about this topic. I mean, that's the definition of a PhD. You are literally the world expert on your topic, which is why some of them are on absolutely blood and hellfire, Icelandic tax records, 1451 to 1452. But of course we're interested. Now, I didn't actually follow what you were saying, however. So,
Yeah,
hang on, let me
well,
finish.
I think the main question was basically that because this PhD, when I look at the data, it's not making the policy, the latest policy that is sort of forcing, not forcing, but promoting that the youngsters has to stay in education up until the age of 18. You know, I know they sort of think there's going to be positive benefits, but for the learners I'm looking at, it doesn't have that positive benefit. So my question firstly was, would you even be interested in the policy, in a project that is pointing out, you know, the opposite effects? And secondly, the fact that I don't have, you know, the long-standing status as many of the other researchers and people you work with. So that was mainly just something I wanted to
I know
flag
nothing
up.
about your research. I have no idea if you are, you know, in a few years' time going to win the BERA medal for being the greatest thing since sliced bread, or whether your PhD supervisor's tearing their hair out because your work's hopeless. I have no idea. But what I can say is that your status as a PhD student makes no difference. The quality of your research is what matters. And at LSE, I have taught students, some of whom have been, well, they've all been passable, none of my students have failed, but there's clearly been a range of quality between my PhD students. Some of them are outstanding and some of them are merely pretty good. And that's what really matters, how good a researcher are you, not what fancy titles you have. We really don't care about that. And we don't care about, you know, it doesn't matter whether you're finding support government policy or oppose it. Now, if you've interviewed 10 people and there were no good outcomes for those 10 people, then ultimately what we will need is your study to be part of the sort of synthesis work that you're doing. Because ultimately, you're not going to change, I'll let you in a moment, you're not going to change government policy on a small qualitative study. Now there I think the quants people have an advantage. You know, in a few years' time, we should be able to use the labour force survey to get at some of those things, and that will be a stratified national sample. So, you know, we regularly look at the returns to different levels of qualifications, absolutely regularly. My team in SARD, the Strategic Analysis and Research Division, are doing that as we speak. So, yes, we're definitely interested.
Yes, I think I can probably do it without. Am I loud enough? Yeah, probably. No.
You might as well have it now.
I might as well. It's here now. Okay. Thank you for your response before. I think the way my brain works is that I need to hear things and have time to mull them over. And thinking about the response that you've just given now, I don't know that I'm entirely happy with the response I got before.
Okay.
Around this issue of qualitative research, because you kind of suggested to me that the qualitative research is only good if a whole load of people are saying the same thing. But I guess one of the things that we're mindful of is a whole load of people are saying the same things, so that means actually the qualitative research is good in the first place. So might you not be listening to the individual qualitative researchers rather than require that 150
yes, that's fair.
qualitative
That's a fair comment.
researchers
So let me
produce
clarify. I wasn't saying the research wasn't good. I categorically wasn't saying that. If I appeared to say that, I absolutely apologise to every qualitative researcher in the room. What I was saying is that at a policy level, my experience is that it's rarely compelling enough to politicians, because politicians usually think about big stuff. You know, their canvas, in the case of DfE, is England, and saying that you have done a qualitative study that is by definition small scale is, in my experience, less compelling to them. Now, I'm not saying that's right, or that they are right to think that, but that is my experience. Secondly, that if every single study on an issue all says exactly the same thing, then clearly, the first one, we can tick. But that's not usually my experience of studies. You can, it's Harry Truman's famous quip of "send me a one-handed economist." The same is true of social research and qualitative research, is you can almost always find one person who thinks the reverse of whatever the general synthesis is. And I'm sure when you're doing your syntheses, you will be able to find one or two outliers who have found legitimately on good research that in their sample it was the opposite. So if we think about RPA, we can easily imagine there's a bunch of level 1 people whose experiences of RPA are very different by the place in which they live, because there will be different job opportunities in different places. So if we only had one study and it was in a place where RPA did not work, whichever turns out to be the minority, then we might get a different thing than when we have the synthesis of a larger number of studies. And that's why in general, I prefer, and I think ministers are often right to prefer, the sort of work you're doing. Why I think the sort of work you're doing at the moment is particularly valuable in terms of policy influence. So I do think that you are more likely to be influential than our colleague from Essex, whose name I'm afraid eludes me, I'm sorry. The gentleman behind?
Tim, that's what you have.
Oh,
You've got
how's
about
the
3
time?
minutes.
Sorry?
About 3 minutes.
About 3 minutes. Right, we all better be quick. We've got one more on the front row. You're going to get the last word.
Good afternoon. I came in late, so if this question's been asked, just bat it away. My name is Matthew Wilkinson. I'm director of an organisation called Curriculum for Cohesion and a research fellow here.
Yep.
We had a strong interaction with civil servants during the National Curriculum Review for History.
Yep.
And I would have thought from a civil servant's point of view, as well as from an academic's point of view, that was a profoundly flawed process that really needs to be thought about for the future. The way that I understood that process working was that before the first draft of the curriculum was published in February 2013, there'd been a 2-year consultation process whereby experts and people that you've just been saying that have a right to feed into policy processes like PhD candidates and graduates compiled a massive body of evidence about the purposes and aims of history and what types of history would do best for pupils in schools. These were fed through the mechanism of the review, and then they were fed through senior civil servants, and they were absolutely, totally and summarily ignored by Michael Gove, who paid not the blindest bit of difference to everything that the experts were saying. And after a 2-year process that was massively expensive for the taxpayer, he just literally on the back of an envelope on his kitchen table wrote the curriculum which he wanted, which then was critiqued and then thankfully became something a little bit more sane, but not nearly as good as it could have been. So my question is, how can academics and civil servants work together so that bloody-minded politicians that are mandated to be bloody-minded actually hear the voice of reason and expertise?
So I answered that in part before, and let me be clear that the job of the civil service is ultimately to serve the government of the day as a legitimate expression of the will of the British people expressed through the ballot box. There will never be an alliance between academics and civil servants against ministers. That will be constitutionally wholly inappropriate. If I think ministers have gone so far to do something that is so unethical, then it is for me to resign and speak from outside. So, can we work together to better inform ministers of the likely consequences of their perception as to the right policy? Of course. And I think actually what you've just described about history was not the policy at its smoothest, and certainly not at its least stressful, but it did ultimately work. We had a policy whereby stuff went up to the Secretary of State. We then had a consultation document, and people responded publicly. And afterwards, as you said, there was a new history curriculum. Now, was it perfectly the one that history academics wanted? No, of course not. It never is. History is the most controversial subject. I mean, and that's not particular to Michael either. Michael did have views on history, but so does Tristram Hunt. You know, the right to define the past is always the victor's prerogative in war. So history, I think, is unique. We don't have the same discussions over the teaching of Oxbow Lakes. We really don't. Nobody, to the best of my knowledge, has ever expressed a preference on that. So, well, people can frame it as a war if they like. I think that rather belittles the nature of war. War is something in which people die. I mean, I'm a historian. I do not like the misuse and the overuse of the word war. So I'm not blaming you for that, but I really don't want to use language like that if I can help it. But afterwards, we had a consultation and we had a response, and the government listened. And say what you like about Michael, he was someone who responded to consultations. And we can point to any number of significant changes in this Parliament in response to consultation documents. Because yes, I mean, Michael is a big figure, he's willing to say what he thinks, but he is also willing to listen, and he did so on that and a number of issues, including secondary accountability and others. So is it flawless, is it perfect? No. As Churchill famously said of democracy, it's the worst system apart from every other one that's been tried. And I think that's where we are now. I'm not claiming it's perfect, but I am claiming that academics are influential, as are the people who respond to consultation documents. Recently, I read all 407 responses to the early years pupil premium consultation. I read them all for the ones on secondary accountability. I read all of them. It was 1,900, I think, on the introduction of a baseline in primary schools. Some of them were very serious. Some of them were a little odd. The one that accused me of dumbing down and misspelling dumbing was, I think, the highlight of my day. Go on, last question, before we run out of time. I think we have... Oh, what time do we finish?
Right. Well, if people are all right to stay, they're missing coffee.
I'll answer it as monosyllabically as I can.
Well, I was going to ask the question, Tim, but I'm actually going to thank you for being here. I'm Mary James, former president of BERA.
You are.
And actually a member of the expert panel, so-called, for the National Curriculum Review.
You were, weren't you? Yes. That was before my time, which is why I didn't remember.
That's an interesting story attached to that, because
yes.
I did offer my resignation at one point, as perhaps you know. I really want to thank you, actually, for being here, and Catherine and Susanna as well, because it is something to come into what's potentially a lion's den, actually. And it is always interesting to have the dialogue. We must keep this dialogue going between
absolutely.
us. I mean, there was a question I had, actually, and that is we're running up to a national a general election.
Yep.
And presumably, if you're a civil servant, you might survive the next general election as a civil servant, that's right.
Yeah, I will.
So I wondered, in terms of BERA having 1,700 members, all have got very different interests in research. If BERA were to put together some briefing papers for all the political parties,
absolutely.
Which do you think are the biggest 3 themes?
Well, I think that would so firstly, it's always easier to influence an opposition because a government has a civil service to ask questions of. So opposition parties are almost always more interested in talking to outsiders. So in terms of your likely influence, it will be with parties not currently in government. I think what government is currently interested in is how to ensure greater equality. You know, we can easily find pockets of excellence, and indeed in some cases quite big chunks of excellence. I mean, particularly the performance of London schools these days is now pretty legendary. I mean, I addressed an OECD conference at which they were gobsmacked that our big city was also our best place for education, with all its inequality, etc. They were genuinely gobsmacked. But how can we get that out of London? How can we get it not just to Stoke-on-Trent, but also to Grimsby and Hartlepool, etc.? Places that are struggling educationally. So I think that is a common theme across all parties. I think there is still a strong interest in all 3 parties on the socio-economics of success. You know, the pupil premium is a lot of money, and we have seen some narrowing of the gaps. But still, we're not quite at the world that Condoleezza Rice put forward in the US, where the postcode of your birth determines your life chances. But we're still closer to that than I think any party is happy with. So I think that's a big one. And I think all parties really want to see how we can embed a school-led system. Because I don't think any party believes that DfE should suddenly become bigger and more dictatorial. So what can be done to make that effective rather than just having anything goes however ineffective it is? So how can you make accountability effective without making it the tail that wags the dog?
Okay, thanks very much. Okay.
Well, since I'm chairing my own session, I know it's usual to applaud speakers at the end, but I don't want you to applaud me. I want you to applaud these 2 people, because they do I get to stand up and take the glory and answer your questions, whereas they've done almost all the hard work. So I would really like you to applaud Catherine and Susanna and all the others in the team who are doing their best to reach out to academics day in, day out, because they are all too often unsung heroes. So I give you Susanna and Catherine.